Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? I love seeing how far our moonlit stories travel. The moon hung heavy over the northern ridge, full and unforgiving, casting silver shadows across the pine forest that had once been her home. Sarah stood at the border of the Blackthorn Pack territory, her breath forming small clouds in the cold autumn air, her heart a drum of fear and defiance beating against her ribs. She had sworn never to return to this place, had carved that vow into her very bones during those first freezing nights of exile, when she had stumbled through these same woods with nothing but the clothes on her back and the crushing weight of rejection burning like a brand upon her soul. But fate, she had learned, cared nothing for the promises we make to protect ourselves. Behind her, bundled in a makeshift sling against her chest, 2 tiny hearts beat in perfect rhythm with her own. The pups. Her pups. 3 months old, with eyes that had only just begun to shift from infant blue to something deeper, something that carried echoes of a man she had tried desperately to forget. They stirred against her now, small whimpers escaping their lips, and she pressed her hand gently over them, whispering reassurances she didn't feel. The forest remembered her. She could sense it in the way the wind moved through the branches, carrying scents of wood smoke and wild thyme, of pack life and belonging, of everything she had lost. The trees stood as silent witnesses, their bark scarred with territorial markings that predated her existence, their roots tangled with secrets and ancient promises made beneath moons just like this one. She had been 23 when Kyle Blackthorn had looked at her with those storm-gray eyes and spoken the words that shattered her world. The rejection had come on a night much like this one, beneath a full moon that seemed to mock her with its perfect, terrible beauty. She had stood in the center of the pack circle, every eye upon her, every breath held in anticipation. The bond had snapped into place just hours before, that sacred recognition between destined mates that was supposed to be the beginning of everything. Instead, it had been the end. She could still hear his voice, cold as winter frost, devoid of the warmth she had glimpsed in stolen glances across pack gatherings, in the brief moments when their eyes had met and something ancient and knowing had passed between them. He had stood before her, the youngest alpha the Blackthorn Pack had known in 3 generations, his shoulders squared with a burden she hadn't understood then, his jaw set with determination. The rejection hadn't been a roar. It had been a whisper that carried across the clearing like a blade made of ice. He had spoken the old words, the ritual phrases that severed a mate bond before it could fully form, and she had felt something inside her crack and splinter. The pain had been physical, yes, a tearing sensation that started in her chest and radiated outward until every nerve sang with agony. But worse had been the emotional devastation, the confusion, the humiliation, the desperate, clawing need to understand why. He had given her no explanation, had simply turned his back as she fell to her knees, as the pack watched with a mixture of pity and relief. Relief, because she was nothing. A weak omega with no family name, no particular strength or gift to offer the pack. A girl who had been taken in as a child when her parents were killed by rogues, raised on the charity and tolerance of others. She had known her place, had accepted it, had never dared to dream that the moon herself might mark her as mate to the alpha, until she had. And then, just as swiftly, that dream had been incinerated. The exile had been immediate. Pack law was clear. A rejected mate could not remain. The bond, though severed, left traces, phantom threads that would torment them both if forced into proximity. Kyle had ordered her gone before dawn, had assigned 2 warriors to escort her to the border and ensure she crossed it. She had stumbled into the wilderness with nothing, had survived those first brutal weeks through sheer stubborn refusal to die, and had eventually found her way to a small human town on the coast where no one asked questions about the haunted look in her eyes or the way she flinched from kindness. She had built a life there, small, quiet, safe, had learned to be human among humans, to hide the wolf that prowled restlessly beneath her skin, had worked in a bookshop that smelled of old paper and possibilities, had rented a tiny apartment above a bakery, had convinced herself that she was healing. And then, one night 4 months ago, she had dreamed of silver eyes and storm clouds, had woken with her sheets twisted around her, and a desperate hunger clawing at her insides. The dream had felt so real. Cale's hands on her skin, his voice rough with need, his body covering hers with an urgency that bordered on desperation. She had felt the mate bond flare to life again, impossible and undeniable. Had felt him inside her not just physically, but spiritually. Two souls crashing together in defiance of the rejection that should have kept them apart. She had woken alone, aching, confused. Had told herself it was just a dream, a cruel trick of a heart that hadn't fully mended. 6 weeks later, she had realized the truth. The impossible, devastating, miraculous truth. The pups stirred again, and Sarah pulled the sling tighter, protective and fierce. They were small, even for twins. Born a month early in that tiny apartment while rain lashed against the windows, and she had labored alone, biting down on a folded towel to muffle her screams because human neighbors would ask questions she couldn't answer. The birth had been brutal, had left her weak and bleeding. But the moment she had held them, one in each arm, their tiny bodies warm and perfect, she had understood that she would do anything, sacrifice anything, to keep them safe. But safety, she had discovered, was not something she could provide alone. The pups were wolf-born, and they needed things she couldn't give them. They needed pack, needed the collective strength and protection that came from belonging to something larger than one desperate woman trying to survive. She had felt it in the way they cried, inconsolable through long nights. Had seen it in the way they struggled to thrive, despite her best efforts. Human milk formula wasn't enough. Human medicine couldn't help. They were fading, slowly but surely, and the knowledge had driven her half mad with fear and helplessness. 3 days ago, the first vision had come. She had been standing at the window of her apartment, one pup against each shoulder, rocking and humming and praying to a moon she could barely see through the coastal fog. And then, suddenly, she had been elsewhere. Had been standing in a forest clearing, moonlight streaming down like liquid silver. And Cale had been there. Not the cold, remote alpha who had rejected her. Not the untouchable leader who had cast her out. But the man beneath the armor. The one she had glimpsed in rare, unguarded moments. His eyes had been wild, desperate, and he had been calling her name like a prayer, like a curse, like the last word he would ever speak. The vision had shattered as quickly as it came, leaving her gasping against the window, the pups wailing in her arms. But it had come again the next night, and the next. Always the same scene. Always Cale, reaching for something he couldn't grasp, crying out for something he had thrown away. She didn't know what it meant, didn't trust it. But she knew, with a certainty that lived in her bones, that she had to return. Not for herself, not for some foolish hope of reconciliation or explanation, but for her children, for the 2 tiny lives that depended on her to set aside pride and pain and do whatever was necessary. So here she stood, at the border she had crossed 3 years ago in the opposite direction, terror and determination warring in her chest. The scent hit her first. Pack. Home. The mingled essence of dozens of wolves living in close proximity, their individual signatures blending into something greater. She caught notes of pine and wood smoke, of leather and wild honey, of the unique combination that made up Blackthorn Pack territory. And beneath it all, faint, but unmistakable, the signature she had tried so hard to forget. Dark cedar and winter storms. Cale. Her wolf surged forward, desperate and yearning, and she had to grip a nearby tree to steady herself. The bond wasn't there, not truly. The rejection had seen to that. But something remained. Some echo or shadow of what might have been, enough to make her entire body ache with longing. One of the pups began to cry, the sound cutting through the night like a knife. Sarah pulled him closer, made soft shushing sounds, but he was hungry and tired and could sense her distress. His twin joined in moments later, and suddenly the quiet forest was filled with the desperate wails of infants demanding what she could no longer adequately provide. She had no choice now. Had crossed the border, had made herself known whether she intended to or not. Pack law was clear about that too. Trespassers would be investigated. She could only hope she would be allowed to speak, to plead her case, before being driven away again, or worse. If this story is stirring your heart, please leave a like and subscribe. It truly helps me bring more tales of love, loss, and destiny. The warriors appeared like shadows given form, materializing from the darkness between the trees with the lethal grace of trained fighters. 3 of them, their eyes glowing amber in the moonlight, their postures aggressive and alert. She recognized one, Marcus, who had been kind to her once, who had taught her to track when she was still a clumsy adolescent learning packways. His eyes widened in recognition, then narrowed in confusion and concern. He lifted a hand, and the other 2 warriors paused, holding position but ready to act if needed. "Sarah?" His voice was rough with disbelief. "You shouldn't be here." "You know you can't—" He cut off as the pup's cries reached him, as his gaze dropped to the bundle against her chest. Understanding dawned slowly, followed by something that looked like horror. "Moon's mercy. Those are— Please." Her voice cracked on the word, all her carefully rehearsed speeches dissolving in the face of this moment. "Please, Marcus. I wouldn't be here if I had any other choice. They're sick. They're fading. They need Pack, and I—" She swallowed hard, forced herself to continue. "I need to speak with the Alpha." Marcus looked torn, his loyalty to Pack law warring with whatever compassion remained from their shared past. The other 2 warriors exchanged glances, clearly uncertain how to proceed. A rejected mate returning was unprecedented enough. A rejected mate returning with pups was something else entirely. "I'll take her to the Alpha." The voice came from behind Marcus, and a figure stepped forward into the moonlight. Lyra, the Pack's healer, a woman of indeterminate age with silver-streaked hair and eyes that seemed to see too much. She had been ancient when Sarah was a child, seemed ancient still, as though she existed slightly outside the normal flow of time. Her gaze fixed on the pups, and something shifted in her expression. Not quite approval, but recognition, as though she had been expecting this. "Stand down. This is a matter for Kale to handle, and him alone." Marcus hesitated, then nodded. He was a warrior, but even warriors didn't argue with Lyra. She moved forward with surprising swiftness, placing herself between Sarah and the male wolves, her posture protective despite the complications this situation represented. "Come, child," she said softly, and there was a gentleness in her tone that made Sarah's throat tighten dangerously. "It's time you all came home." The walk through the territory felt surreal, like moving through a dream painted in shades of memory and moonlight. Everything was familiar and foreign at once. The path through the pines that led to the main compound, the standing stones that marked the heart of Packlands, ancient granite monoliths carved with symbols that predated written language, the collection of cabins and communal buildings that housed the Pack, warm lights glowing in windows, the sounds of life and laughter drifting out into the night. Sarah kept her head down, conscious of the eyes that followed their progress. Word would spread quickly. The rejected mate had returned, had brought pups that anyone with functioning senses would recognize as carrying the Alpha's bloodline. The scent of them alone would be enough, that unique signature that marked them as Blackthorn. Lyra led her not to the Alpha's house, as she had expected, but to her own cabin at the edge of the compound. It was small but comfortable, filled with the scent of herbs and healing, walls lined with jars and bottles whose contents Sarah could only guess at. The healer gestured to a chair near the fireplace, and Sarah sank into it gratefully, her legs trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline. "Let me see them," Lyra said, and it wasn't a request. Sarah hesitated only a moment before loosening the sling, carefully extracting first one pup, then the other. They had quieted somewhat during the walk, but now they fussed and squirmed, tiny fists waving in the air. Lyra took the first one, the boy, slightly smaller, with dark hair already coming in thick, and examined him with practiced efficiency. Her expression grew more serious with each passing moment. "How old?" she asked. 3 months. They came early." "Have they shifted yet?" Sarah shook her head. "No. I don't think they have the strength." Lyra made a soft sound that might have been sympathy or concern, then reached for the second pup. The girl, who had Sarah's lighter hair but already showed signs of having her father's bone structure. The examination was just as thorough, just as grim. "They need to be integrated into the pack immediately," Lyra said finally, returning both pups to Sarah's arms. "Their wolves are too weak. They can't sustain themselves on their own, and neither can you. The pack bond would strengthen them, give them what they need to thrive." She paused, her ancient eyes searching Sarah's face. "But you know what that means, don't you? What will be required?" Sarah did know. Integration meant claiming. Meant Cale acknowledging them as his, accepting them into the pack hierarchy, extending his protection and the benefits of pack bonds. It meant he would have to face what had happened between them, would have to make a choice that would affect not just her and the pups, but the entire pack structure. "Will he?" she asked, and hated how small her voice sounded. "Will he accept them?" Lyra's expression softened. "Kyle has been half mad these past 4 months. Hasn't been sleeping. Stands out beneath the moon every night like he's searching for something. The pack has been worried, though none dare speak of it openly." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "The mate bond is a mysterious thing, child. Even severed, even rejected, it leaves marks, leaves openings. On certain nights, when the veil is thin and the moon is full, things that shouldn't be possible become possible. Souls that were meant to join find ways to come together, even across the barriers we erect." Understanding dawned slowly, heating Sarah's cheeks. The dream. Not just a dream. Somehow, impossibly, it had been real. The bond had reached across distance and rejection, had pulled them together in that liminal space between sleeping and waking, and the result was the 2 tiny lives she now held. "Does he know?" she whispered. "He knows something happened. Knows he dreamed of you, woke with your scent on his skin and your name on his lips. But whether he's connected that to this..." Lyra gestured to the pups. "I cannot say. You'll have to be the one to tell him." The door to the cabin burst open before Sarah could respond, and suddenly the small space was filled with a presence so commanding, so overwhelming, that the air itself seemed to thicken. Cale stood in the doorway, his chest heaving as though he'd run the entire way, his eyes wild and fixed on her with an intensity that stole her breath. He looked different, older, harder, as though the 3 years since she'd seen him had carved new lines into his face. His dark hair was longer, tied back carelessly. His jaw was shadowed with stubble. But his eyes, those storm-gray eyes that had haunted her dreams, were exactly as she remembered. Exactly as they had been in that vision that had driven her back to this place. Sarah. Her name was a rasp, a prayer, a question he couldn't quite form. His gaze dropped to the pups in her arms, and she watched as the color drained from his face. Watched as understanding hit him like a physical blow. His knees actually buckled, and he caught himself against the doorframe, one hand pressed to his chest as though something inside had just cracked open. "Cale," she started, but he was already moving, was crossing the cabin in 3 long strides, was dropping to his knees before her chair, his hands hovering near the pups, but not quite touching, as though afraid they might disappear if he tried. "How?" The word was barely audible. "How is this possible?" Sarah looked to Lyra, who nodded and quietly slipped from the cabin, giving them the privacy this moment demanded. When the door clicked shut behind her, Sarah took a shaking breath and told him. Told him about the dream that wasn't a dream, about waking alone and aching, about the realization 6 weeks later that had turned her world upside down. Told him about the pregnancy, the difficult birth, the slow understanding that the pups needed more than she could give. Cale listened without interrupting, his eyes never leaving the twins. Tears tracked down his face, silent and unchecked, and she had never seen him like this. Had never seen him stripped of his armor, vulnerable and raw and completely undone. "I rejected you," he said finally, and his voice was hollow with self-loathing. "I threw you away, sent you out into the cold with nothing. And you," he swallowed hard, "you carried my children alone, gave birth alone, raised them alone." "Sarah, Why?" The word burst from her before she could stop it, carrying 3 years of pain and confusion. "Why did you reject me? I've replayed that night 1,000 times and I still don't understand. The bond was real. I felt it. You felt it. So why?" Cale's jaw clenched, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he reached into his shirt and pulled out a leather cord, from which hung a small silver pendant. He held it out to her, and she recognized it immediately. A wolf's head, intricately carved, set with 2 small rubies for eyes. The Blackthorn Alpha's mate token, passed down through generations. "This belonged to my mother," he said quietly. "She wore it until the day she died. The day she was murdered by a rival pack who wanted to destabilize our leadership by killing the Alpha's mate." His fingers tightened around the pendant. "I was 15. I watched her die, Sarah. Watched her blood soak into the earth while my father howled his grief and rage. Watched what her death did to him. He was never the same, never whole again. He led the pack for another decade, but he was a ghost, just going through the motions. When he died, I think it was a relief. He could finally join her. Understanding began to dawn, cold and bitter. So when the bond snapped into place, I panicked. The admission was raw. You were so young, so vulnerable, an omega with no family, no real standing in the pack. I thought if I claimed you, I'd be painting a target on your back. Thought I'd be signing your death warrant. My enemies would see you as my greatest weakness, and they'd be right. The bond was so strong, Sarah, stronger than anything I'd ever felt. I knew that losing you would destroy me the way losing my mother destroyed my father, and His voice broke. I convinced myself that rejection was kinder, that it would hurt less than watching you die because of me. "So you broke both of us instead," she said, and there was no anger in it, just weary understanding. "Yes." He looked at the pups again, reached out tentatively, and let his finger be grasped by the girl's tiny fist. His expression transformed, wonder and grief and desperate love warring for dominance. But the bond wouldn't let us go. Found a way, even through the rejection. Gave us these perfect, impossible children. He raised his eyes to hers, and she saw everything in them: regret, hope, fear, determination. "I was wrong, Sarah. I thought I was protecting you, but all I did was cause pain. You survived anyway. Survived and brought our children back to me. You're stronger than I ever gave you credit for." "They're sick," she whispered, needing him to understand the urgency. "They need pack. Need to be claimed and integrated. I don't care what that means for us, Cale. I don't care about explanations or apologies or any of it. I just need you to save them. Us," he corrected gently. "Save us. Because I'm claiming all 3 of you if you'll allow it. Not because you need protection, or because pack law demands it, but because you're mine. You've always been mine, from the moment the moon marked us. I threw that away once. I won't make that mistake again." He stood slowly, carefully, and held out his hand. Not commanding, not demanding, offering. "Will you come home, Sarah? You and our children? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that I'm worthy of the second chance fate has given us?" Sarah looked at his hand, outstretched and steady, despite the tears still wet on his face. Looked at the man who had shattered her, who had just laid his heart bare and given her the power to shatter him in return. Looked at her children who needed this, who needed him, needed Pack, needed the future he was offering. She thought about forgiveness, about how it wasn't the same as forgetting, wasn't about erasing the past or pretending the pain hadn't happened. Thought about how love, real love, meant choosing each other despite the scars, because of them even. Meant acknowledging the wounds and deciding to heal together rather than apart. She took his hand. The claiming ceremony happened beneath the full moon, with the entire pack gathered in the ancient circle of standing stones. Lyra performed the ritual, her voice carrying across the clearing as she spoke words older than memory. Kyle stood with Sarah before him, one pup cradled against each of his shoulders, and when he spoke the claiming words, the inverse of the rejection he had given 3 years ago, Sarah felt something inside her shift and settle, felt the phantom threads of the mate bond weave themselves back together, stronger now for having been broken and repaired. The pack howled their acceptance, and the sound rose to the moon like a prayer of thanksgiving. Sarah felt the pack bonds click into place, felt herself becoming part of something larger again, felt her children's life force strengthen almost immediately as they were wrapped in the collective warmth and power of the pack. Thank you for listening until the end. Tell me in the comments what moved your heart the most, and don't forget to subscribe. Welcome to our family of moonlit souls. Epilogue. The Whisper of the Moon. 5 years later, Sarah stood in the same clearing, watching her children play among the standing stones. They were strong now, healthy and vibrant, their wolves emerging with all the power of their bloodline. The boy had his father's leadership instincts, already organizing the other pack children into elaborate games. The girl had her mother's quiet observation, seeing details others missed, offering kindness when it was needed most. Kale came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and pressed a kiss to her temple. They had built something beautiful from the ruins of what had been, had learned to trust again, to love without fear, had expanded their family, twin girls born 2 years ago, and another boy just beginning to toddle. Do you ever regret it? Kale asked softly, the question he asked sometimes in the quiet moments, as though still afraid she might disappear. Coming back? Giving me another chance? Sarah turned in his arms, reached up to cup his face. Every scar has a story, she said. Every wound teaches us something. We broke, and we healed, and we're stronger for it. Our children exist because the moon wouldn't let us go, because fate knows better than we do sometimes. She smiled. So no, I don't regret it. I wouldn't change a single moment, because all of it, the pain and the healing, brought us here. He kissed her then, deep and thorough and full of promise. And above them, the moon shone down on the pack lands with approval, her silver light blessing the family that had fought so hard to find their way back to each other. For in the end, some bonds cannot be broken, only tested, and those that survived the testing emerge transformed, not despite the darkness they've weathered, but because of it. Love, true love, isn't found in the perfect moments. It's forged in the broken ones, when we choose to stay, to heal, to try again. The moon knows this. She always has. And on nights when her light falls just right, when the veil between what is and what might be grows thin, she whispers her ancient wisdom to those brave enough to listen. Some souls are meant to find each other, no matter how many times they're torn apart. Some loves are destined to endure, no matter how much darkness they must traverse. And some families are worth fighting for, worth bleeding for, worth choosing over and over again until the choosing becomes as natural as breathing. Sarah had been cast out beneath the full moon, had returned beneath it with the cries of pups calling for their mother. And now, beneath that same eternal moon, she had found not just a home, but a wholeness she had never imagined possible. The moon watched and smiled and blessed them all.